Hello and welcome to The Bookshelf, where we discuss books relevant to the study of contemporary South Asia. I'm John Vater, a research associate at the Institute. Today I have with me Amish Raj Mulmi, the author of the book All Roads Lead North, Nepal's Turn to China. Mr. Mulmi is a Nepal analyst whose writings have been published in the books The Himalayan Arc, Journeys East of Southeast, as well as The Best Asian Speculative Fiction 2018. He has written for, among others, Al Jazeera, Roads and Kingdoms, Himal South Asian, India Today, The Kathmandu Post, and The Record. He is a consulting editor at Writer's Side Literary Agency and has previously worked for Juggernaut Books and Hachette India. Amish, welcome to The Bookshelf.
Thank you, John, for having me over. It's a pleasure.
So we'll just jump straight into the questions. In your book's introduction, you state how Nepal is often looked at through an India-first perspective. And one of the effects of this is that many of the countries of the subcontinent are, somewhat robbed of their, appropriate nuance and agency. And in Nepal's case, some of the cultural and economic nuances involve its historical interactions with China and Tibet. Elsewhere in the book, you say that Nepal has again re-entered the geostrategic spotlight. So for those of us who study South Asia, can you tell us why Nepal has become such a significant country for us to look at today, and why these roads that lead north that you referenced in your title matter?
I think, John, we have to understand why Nepal is an important country in South Asia to look at in terms of geostrategic significance. I think we have to go back to its very beginnings, because Nepal is pretty much the oldest nation state in its current form in South Asia since the 18th century. So that's firstly. And since its very beginnings, it's a landlocked nation state that has negotiated its sovereignty between two giant neighbors. And its foreign policy has been motivated by balance between these two neighbors. Its rulers, its politicians, all of them have sort of emphasized on this fact of non-alignment. That is the first part, obviously. The second part obviously comes from the Himalaya itself coming back into the geopolitical spotlight. But in the past, during the Cold War, we know that Nepal was a center of Cold War intrigues. We know that the US had funded anti-China guerrilla movement by the Tibetans centering out of Nepal. We know that India and China were also playing out their little games here. And finally, we also have to understand that there is the India-China rivalry is once again back into focus. And within South Asia, the India-China rivalry in terms of third countries, the spotlight primarily comes on Nepal. In the past as well, when, let's say, the Lhasa-Kathmandu road was being built, or now when, let's say, this Nepal has signed on to the BRI, and then a train is supposed to be coming from China, and now India has signed up for its own train from Kathmandu to the Indian border. At the same time, the geopolitical significance of Nepal also comes from the fact that it holds the second largest Tibetan exile population after India. And that matters significantly for China because it's a big security interest. And now you have new American interests in the form of MCC, or the Millennium Challenge Compact, Millennium Challenge Cooperation Compact, which has essentially become a sort of a geopolitical tug of war between sort of US and China, with one group of politicians saying, okay, this is a US ploy to bring us into a security alliance. The other group saying that, no, this is a purely development initiative and we need the money. So because of these many reasons, I think Nepal is an important, or rather the goings on in Nepal tell us a lot about this great power geopolitical rivalries. And finally, I think it's also interesting to look at Chinese, let's say we talk about China across the world now, but we rarely talk about how developing countries like Nepal respond to Chinese overtures or Chinese investments. Usually the story is restricted to how China has made inroads into a particular country, but there is little thought given to what what sort of nuances or what sort of historical context or contemporary scenarios are there in a particular country for China's investments, for it to be open to China's investments, right? So I think, yeah, these would be the reasons I would say that Nepal remains an important country.
Yeah, there are a lot of reasons, good reasons that you've mentioned there. And I think that your final point about the perspective of some of these developing countries in Nepal leads well into my next question, which is how you approach this book. Your book broadly has two arcs. One is Nepal's history with China, and the second is how China has affected the lives of the ordinary Nepali people. So you greatly focus on a people's perspective. So basically, I want to ask, what is it that this people's perspective can tell us about Nepal's engagement with China and the turn toward the north that perhaps the developmental reports or geopolitical analyses can't tell us?
No, see, the first is to obviously, it's important to discern that Chinese investments, or for that matter, any foreign investments, are equally a signal of big power intent as much as diplomatic affairs, right? And policy decisions remain the biggest driving factor in people's lives. But having said that, a people's perspective gives us a different view, not just of history, but also of contemporary times. When we focus on people and their views, it shines a spotlight on how locals imagine or view or comprehend or even absorb these big power overtures. And this view is important because we also talk about regions, especially in the Himalaya, where the modern nation state is finally making its presence felt in these regions. The Himalayan regions, earlier historically, they've always been outside the mainstream discourse of the nation state, or they were seen as frigid frontier zones on the margins of the state. These are zones to defend rather than imbue with, let's say, sovereignty and incorporate into the mainland. And now what's happening is that, as we've seen in the mountains, in the Himalaya here, whether it's because of China's infrastructure investments, or whether because of great power rivalry, or because Nepal itself is expanding its state mechanisms through new roads, through new development processes, these frontier zones, so as to say, are becoming more accessible, and their voices are being heard in the mainstream. And my decision to put this perspective first was a conscious decision, but it's also one based on what I thought was the perceptions of the Nepali people. I wanted to investigate how China is viewed in the country. I wanted to see whether Nepalis look at China from the Indian lens or on its own. And is there any sort of does the historical relationship play on their mind? Does the relationship with people and ethnicities, the historical relation will matter? And how do they view these new investments? Are they benefiting from it? And ultimately, we have to remember that those who take the decisions in pluralistic countries like ours, they're ultimately representatives of these same communities and people. So a gamut of these factors, when you bring them together, my sense was that it gives you, yes, the geopolitical factor, you can never take away from that, right? The center obviously decides policies, and bilateral ties are determined by the center. But when you go down to the ground level, you get I would say, a different view, a view that is, let's say, less distorted by this great power rivalry, and sort of puts the focus back on the people. Because ultimately, like I said, if it's an economic decision, it will affect the people first and foremost, right?
Yeah, and let's maybe spend a little bit more time at the ground level, because your book offers some very compelling case studies of several communities who are living along the Himalayan borderlands. For instance, you talk about Limi Valley, Mustang, and Rasua. So I'm wondering if you can, tell us a little bit about the insights that you gained from speaking with the peoples in these communities, and the ways in which, their personal experience of China's economic rise, the infrastructural push on the border, the way in which the modern nation state is expanding in that Himalayan frontier is directly impacting, their prospects and aspirations for the future, but also maybe areas that they are concerned about.
I think see, when we talk about communities in the Himalayan region, the first is obviously to acknowledge the historical, let's say, relationship that they have traditionally had with Tibet, right? And in terms of the trade, in terms of the trans-Himalayan trade that used to go on, in terms of the ethnic and familial relations that used to happen between communities on this side of the mountains and the other side, right? And subsequently, how did they come to terms with the PRC, the People's Republic of China, entering Tibet in 1950? And we know that after China entered the Tibet in 1950, we see modern nation state, let's say modern nation border systems coming into play. We see traditional trade collapsing. So how did these communities come to terms with that? How to come to terms with modern economic systems, right? The second is obviously this push towards in LDCs about development as a state narrative, and how these communities are being incorporated into this national, let's say, the mainstream discourse about development, right? We also have to understand, why are these communities adapting to China's infrastructure push today? Like, why is it now? The obvious reason is the economic opportunities that China's urban push in these mountains provides. And you have people who are working in, let's say, border towns. You have people who are conducting trade, businesses, and entire communities are relying on Tibetan border towns for essential supplies. So one of the things that is very, very noticeable is that the residents along the borderlands, they have negotiated the border itself as an economic resource. And it's not that the larger geopolitics doesn't play on their mind. And it does. I mean, they're very careful to, let's say, not irritate China, so as to say, because we've seen that, for example, in September, in a couple of years ago, 4 Nepalese were convicted of the murder of a Chinese national in Burang, in Nyari prefecture in western Tibet. And China effectively shut down the border and sent back all the Nepalese who were working in the town at that time. So China's unilateralism on the border is very, very clear. So it makes it imperative for border communities to be on good terms with the authorities, right? The center is thus, it's never too far away from the periphery's calculations, because they have to negotiate it on an almost everyday basis. It's essentially the border, right? You're traversing two countries authorities, so you have to do that. And the final thing that I found to be most fascinating was that we have to see this decision by these border communities to engage with China economically as a citizen-led push. Like, you have the state on the Nepali side, which is only now making inroads into these Himalayan regions. But they've discovered that, all right, if we cannot do it better with the South because of infrastructure reasons, we can perhaps chart our own course from the North. So it's a development course that is shaped by local initiatives rather than something that's directed top down. So the periphery is in a sense taking charge of their own economic future. And that particular facet to me was very, very fascinating, because it taught me a lot about how modern nation states are sort of, it's a sort of a thing of going push and pull from both sides, where the center is obviously like trying to pull the periphery into its, let's say, grasp. But the periphery at the same time is also realizing, all right, do we need to engage with the center, or can we engage with the border on our own terms? So these sort of ideas, I thought, and I wanted to capture that, right? And it seems that it has been successful to a large degree. But of course, you always have, like I said, China's unilateralism is there. So how do they negotiate that? How do they continue to do that? That to me is the most, let's say, interesting aspect of this side of the mountains. So
yeah, one of the very fascinating aspects to me is you talk about how in places like Limi Valley, for the community, they have their own social sovereignty, and how in many ways it's not just Nepali law that has sway, but the customs and traditions of their own community over time. And you kind of make a pivot in your book after talking about some of the borderland communities by also talking about ways in which this idea of sovereignty is affected also at the center in places like Kathmandu or in Pokhara. Because you have Chinese investments coming in the private sector, you also have the tourism industry, which is becoming increasingly lucrative for Nepal. But you asked the question in your book, and I'm just kind of turning this question around back at you because you've made the job for me a bit easier. How can Kathmandu take advantage of this, relationship without also eroding some of its own control and sovereignty? So I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit more about some of these aspects.
No, I think, see, with any small country, big great country, great power relationship, there is an fundamental asymmetry, right? Like, I mean, especially with China. Let's for example, for instance, with Nepal's relationship with China, I just talked about Chinese unilateralism on border controls. What we have is, I'll give you a few instances. For example, in Mustang, a border fence was erected after the Karmapa fled in 1999 unilaterally, right? It's a 22-kilometer long border. You close the border and trade on pandemic grounds from the one land border crossing point that was operating since the earthquake, and it's still not operational function fully, like in Rasua. For the past 2 years, it's been let's say an erratic, functioning of the border itself. You've sent back Nepalis on criminal charges, and we've also seen instances where, in the case of Tibetan exiles, you have allowed, like Nepal has deported someone on the instructions of China. So I think what you have here is obviously a small country basically getting, I wouldn't say pressure as much as getting, it makes it imperative, as it is in the border communities, to keep China on good terms, to keep, neighbors on good terms. And essentially it comes from the fact that smaller countries just do not have the wherewithal or the diplomatic assertiveness that is essential to say that, look, you cannot close the border unilaterally, you have to talk about this. And this is not the first time that this has happened to Nepal. I mean, we saw much more, emphatic border, blockade in 2015 on the southern border when India closed off the border points, which motivated Nepali leaders to look to China as an economic alternative to India. So you have that as well. So what we have currently, and this is common to most smaller states, and you have border asymmetries. And for example, right now you have charges of new construction in areas where the Nepali state isn't present or has limited capacity. You have unilateral decisions on the border, and you have various incentives and pressures to conform to these great power demands. And at the same time, I mean, state institutions aren't fully realized in LDCs either, right? So this means that smaller countries have very, very little leeway in determining how the sovereignties can be eroded by such decisions, especially when you have two bigger neighbors on either side. But having said that, I think one of the things that is clear in Nepali foreign policy for the past several years is that there is the emphasis on non-alignment. The emphasis on non-alignment sort of allows a political class and an establishment to get away without having a policy at all to begin with. How do you engage with China on Nepali terms? Or how do you engage with India on Nepali terms, right? And with India, you have a special bilateral relationship where you have an open border. You have both nationals of both countries can work in each other without any visas. So how do you take advantage of these on our own terms? I think that is something the Nepali leadership is yet to, comprehend or fully realize. And this is not something that is, historically been there. I mean, in the 60s, we saw that Nepal had been able to, negotiate with China for a Lhasa-Kathmandu road, at the same time negotiate a defense agreement with India, to keep assuring them of the security interests. You had the Soviets investing in foreign aid, plants here. You had the Americans doing that. So all these great powers were here at the same time. And yet it was not a situation where you had to, how it is being depicted today about Kathmandu leaning one way or the other. So I think it can be done. It just requires greater vision on part of the leadership, which is something that is, I would say, lacking currently in Nepal.
Yeah, there's the adage which is often bandied around of Nepal being like the yam caught between two
Yeah.
boulders, and for better or worse, Nepal as well as its politics is looked at through the prism of Nepal, India, China, and to this triangular relationship, like you mentioned toward the start of the interview. The US has kind of entered the fray with the Millennium Challenge Corporation Compact and the Indo-Pacific strategy. Um, in terms of Nepal navigating these dynamics on its own terms, could you tell us a little bit about what's been happening in Nepal's domestic politics recently? And are these politics in any way beginning to become are they intersecting more with the changes happening regionally and globally?
Uh, Let me see. So Nepal's domestic politics, the first question is obviously how far back do you want me to go? Because a year is a long, long time in Nepal, right? So let me just give you a small, let's say, instance of the prime ministership of KP Oli, the most, perhaps the, let's say, I would say the most visible leader and who a Nepali leader who's been veering towards China since 2015. And what happened was that KP Oli, during the 2015 blockade, he was fiercely against India. He gave speeches, like in his words and his actions, he was very much against India, and he rose to power on this ethnic nationalist discourse. He won the elections on that discourse, on that propaganda itself. He joined hands with the Maoists to become this Nepal Communist Party, and many said the Nepal Communist Party was obviously, let's say, backed by China, because China wanted to see the communists in power in Nepal. You have so once KP Oli comes into power, Nepal signs a slew of agreements, trade agreements, transit agreements, petroleum agreements with China. But 2 years into his rule, none of these agreements sort of materialize. Like there is no movement on any of them. What we see is that KP Oli is being challenged inside his party by Prachanda, who's the Maoist leader, and another UML, another communist leader. And this domestic politics fallout is being seen on international foreign policy. So suddenly, in the middle of all of this, we have India issuing a new political map in which it shows a territory that Nepal claims to have as its own in far western Nepal. So suddenly KP Oli again comes back to his anti-Indian, let's say, discourse. There's a lot of speeches about that. But the domestic pressures in his party continue. I mean, the leaders continue to tell him to step down. He's essentially, what the question is basically, he's both the prime minister as well as the chairman of the party. So the leaders are telling him, you choose one, right? Oli's like, no, I will keep both. And so to manage all of this, and meanwhile, recall that none of the agreements with China has moved forward, right? They've just been signed. There's no movement on any of them. Suddenly, what happens is the Oli sort of like dissolves the parliament. He warms up to India. Indian leaders start visiting him. He starts giving speeches in which he says that I did not issue the new political map of the new Nepali political map that was issued in response to India's new political map. The other parties, sort of domestically, I was forced to issue it. He becomes perceivably closer to India. So, and suddenly you have this situation where the Oli government that had so far been perceived as being close to China suddenly turns towards India. So this is just one example, right? And the second example I can give you is the MCC, right? MCC is a bilateral treaty. It has been signed, but it needs to be implemented through only after being ratified by Parliament. But the Parliament, there is no single party that has a majority. So the MCC essentially has become a tool for disinformation and misinformation. As I said, most you have disinformation campaigns that are basically saying that, oh, Nepal will turn into another Afghanistan, or American troops will enter Nepal because of the MCC. So what we have to one essential characteristic of Nepali foreign policy, or Nepal in general, has been that political parties that are considered close to particular neighbors or policy decisions are they driven by neighbors' interests, right? So you always have a flip-flop in agreements. You have, let's say you've signed a particular contract with a company, but a new government comes in and that contract is cancelled. So, and this is not new, right? And like I said, like, I mean, we've had this in the 60s as well, where we've had to balance multiple power centers and multiple foreign, let's say, powers. The difference is that Nepal has had a frequent change in governments, right? So there's no continuity in foreign policy at all. And number two, because domestic actors are perceived to be close to foreign actors, Nepal's policy choices, even the domestic policy choices, are seen from that prism domestically, internally, right? By the media, by the public society at large, right? And finally, what happens is we've signed multiple agreements, but there is a clear lack of initiative to move ahead on any of these agreements because of domestic political demands. And sometimes it's our own weakness. Another example that I can give you is India has built railway lines, broad gauge railway lines in the south of the country, and Nepal has bought 2 trains at a pretty high cost. But the trains have been lying idle for the past 2 years because we have not been able to come to a consensus on how to operate them. So there's a very lovely quote that I thought summarized the bureaucracy of Nepal. Like, to run the trains, we need laws, and we don't have laws. And there is nothing about, like, I mean, you essentially what he's trying to say is that you need the law to hire the engineers or the technicians to run the trains, and we don't have that. So
I wish I could stay on this topic with you a bit longer, because you do talk about some of the institutional bureaucratic issues, within Nepal, and also a character of a certain degree of ideological fluidity. So communism takes on many different shades in the Nepali context. But unfortunately, we're running out of time. Maybe we can have you back later. I just have one final question, beginning with a little bit of publicity for your book. So All Roads Lead North was very well written, and it had, I felt, sort of some V.S. Naipaul-esque qualities where you really pay attention to detail, and I can tell that you cared quite a bit about the writing. You also have some allusions to some other literary figures. You begin with a reference to Borges, how knowing the present is very difficult, as well as to Coetzee on the effects of empire on how we experience our day-to-day lives. So to kind of come back to one of my very first questions, do you think that this type of approach would be helpful in kind of fleshing out or adding nuance to some of the larger debates which are happening at a very grand scale today about things like the liberal, multilateral order, or the importance of democracy, when in places like some of these borderland, villages, the things that they're thinking about and experiencing are quite different? Or would you say that the way you went about this book is more so a reflection of what you find interesting and what the story that you felt you could personally contribute to?
no, of course. I think as with any book, right? Like, it was, like I said, it was a personal and a very conscious decision to take that route. But the more I think about it, the more I also believe that the spotlight on security matters, in geopolitics, especially in smaller countries, erodes these civilizational histories that our relationships are based on. I mean, small countries at the end of the day do not have much to offer in terms of security, let's say, affairs, right? But you also have to realize that diplomacy in smaller countries is often predicated on the fact that smaller countries are that much more sensitive about sovereignty than greater powers. So the focus on this incessant focus on security can as much harm interests as benefit them. And I mean, there are also wider ranging issues that matter in the 21st century. I mean, the simplest thing I can think of is climate change and disaster preparedness in the Himalayas. Now, this is a cross-border issue, but it's rarely talked about in those terms. We know it requires inter-country cooperation, but we don't see any sort of initiative based on that, right? And diplomacy, ultimately, like I said, it is based on histories. So while the economic and security spotlight is important, we must not consider it the foundation of the relationship. If we do that, then it turns the relationship into a transactional one. So if a relationship is transactional, then if another great power steps in with a better offer, who rivals cannot complain, right? So I think finally the point is, as I said in the beginning, that we have to understand that LDC populations are that much more better informed, and better connected to the outside world than in previous generations. There are new aspirations, and they're also forming their own views on how the country is run. The limits of hard diplomacy can be seen even today. Like, I mean, the focus on security alone does not address LDC aspirations and interests. And which is why big powers are now focusing on connectivity and infrastructure, along with economic investments, as a way to negotiate and sustain their own interests. And like I said, most economic investments have a direct impact on people's lives, especially big ticket investments that often generate an economy of their own. So with all these, keeping all these in mind, my sense was that if I thought about the security relationship alone, it would be a simple one-sided view that wouldn't give a larger picture, a clearer picture of how ties have been sustained historically, how they are in the present, and what the future basically possibilities are. You know, and I think it's important, and this is something that I've emphasized in other places as well, that we have to think about, especially in the Himalaya, you have to think about cross-border cooperation in wider terms. I mean, especially we know that, I mean, climate change is real. We know that it's coming, and we've just had an unseasonable heavy floods just about 2 weeks ago. But no one is talking about it like, okay, we need to have this. Like, yes, there is an IPCC or all of that, but can great powers get over the security-led perspective to focus on these issues that matter to the people on the ground? That is the challenge, right?
Well, I think the challenges and future possibilities are a good point for us to sign off. Amish, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure, John. Thank you so much.
And I encourage everyone who's watching to also check out our other bookshelf videos, reviews, and ISAS papers on our website. Thank you again.